The household staff of Ashford Manor presented themselves in the library at 10 o'clock that morning, arranged with the sort of careful hierarchy that one observes in well-ordered establishments, where the servants possess a keener appreciation for precedence than did many of the nobility for whom they labored. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 60 years, possessed of that indefinable quality of absolute reliability that comes from having managed the domestic affairs of the same household for upwards of 30 years without incident or scandal. She was accompanied by Margaret, the chambermaid, a nervous creature of perhaps 24, who had apparently been in service at Ashford Manor for only 18 months, and whose fingers, Wimsey observed with interest, bore the marks of someone accustomed to heavy laundering work, the tips worn and discoloured in a manner that suggested either excessive diligence or obsessive habits of cleanliness. There was also present Frederick, the groundskeeper, a taciturn man of indeterminate age whose hands bore the calluses of someone long accustomed to manual labour, and whose demeanour suggested the sort of philosophical acceptance of fate that one observes in those who have spent most of their lives engaged in combat with recalcitrant vegetation and unreliable weather. The butler, a gentleman of considerable dignity named Harrison, was conspicuously absent, having, as Mrs. Pemberton explained with evident discomfort, taken the liberty of departing the house early that morning upon what he described as a matter of personal urgency, leaving word that he would return before noon. Wimsey settled himself into a leather chair with the air of a man preparing to engage in conversation of a leisurely and entirely casual nature, though his eyes retained that quality of peculiar focus that had characterized his demeanour since his examination of the fragment of grey-green fabric. He began his inquiries not with questions regarding the events of the previous evening or the movements of Mr. Carstairs, but rather with what appeared to be a comprehensive examination of the household's mechanical arrangements. He inquired, with the sort of casual precision that marked his interrogations as fundamentally different from those of the police, regarding the precise mechanisms by which the household maintained its temporal accuracy. Was there a master clock? Where was it situated? Had anyone noticed, within the past fortnight, any irregularities in its operation? Mrs. Pemberton, somewhat mystified by this line of inquiry, explained that the drawing-room clock had been serviced by the village clockmaker only 2 months previously, and had kept excellent time ever since. Wimsey then asked, in what appeared to be a random digression, whether the household ever experienced difficulties with the plumbing arrangements, or whether the pipes in the upper corridors had a tendency to produce those peculiar sounds that old houses so often exhibited during the hours of darkness. Margaret flushed at this question for reasons that were not immediately apparent, and Mrs. Pemberton replied that the pipes were occasionally troublesome, particularly late at night when water was being drawn for the bedrooms. It was at this juncture that Wimsey introduced what appeared to be an entirely unrelated question, inquiring whether the household had ever engaged in the practice of reupholstering any of the furniture within the past several years, and if so, whether any of the original fabric had been retained rather than discarded. The question hung in the air for several moments before Mrs. Pemberton admitted, with obvious reluctance, that approximately 4 years previously Mr. Carstairs had undergone an economy in his domestic arrangements, and had authorized the reupholstering of certain pieces in the morning-room using fabric of considerably less expensive quality than the original. When pressed for details regarding the disposition of the original material, Mrs. Pemberton confessed that much of it had been retained by the household. Old fabric, she explained, was invariably useful for purposes of dusting and polishing. Some of it, she believed, had been given to Margaret for the purposes of cleaning the household's more delicate surfaces, as the girl had a particular talent for such work. Wimsey rose then and expressed a desire to examine the morning-room at his earliest convenience, remarking that one could scarcely form a complete picture of Mr. Carstairs' domestic arrangements without observing the setting in which he had spent so many of his daylight hours. As he conducted the small party through the corridors of Ashford Manor, a house of considerable Victorian substance, all heavy draperies and densely patterned wallpapers, he continued his inquiries with an almost soporific quality of relaxation that concealed the relentless precision of his questioning. He asked Mrs. Pemberton regarding the household's sleeping arrangements, whether any of the servants had reason to be awake during the hours between midnight and dawn, whether the master's bedroom was situated in proximity to the servants' quarters, and whether Mr. Carstairs had been in the habit of taking his constitutional walks during the evening hours, or whether such perambulations were reserved exclusively for the morning. To each question, Mrs. Pemberton responded with increasing avide. NT discomfort, her answers becoming progressively more careful and circumlocutory. Upon reaching the morning room, Whimsy requested that the others remain at the threshold whilst he conducted a more thorough examination of the furniture and draperies, a request that was granted with visible relief by all parties concerned. For a period of perhaps 10 minutes, Whimsy moved about the room with the deliberate methodology of a man engaged in archaeological excavation, his attention devoted to the examination of seams, the inspection of worn areas upon the upholstery, and the careful observation of those minute variations in fabric wear that suggest patterns of repeated contact. He then produced the fragment of grey-green material that he had retrieved from the archway, comparing it with meticulous care to the upholstery of a particular chair. The chair, as it happened, that occupied a position directly before the room's substantial bay window. When he finally emerged from the morning room, his expression had undergone a subtle but unmistakable alteration. The casual amusement that had characterized his features throughout the morning had been replaced by something considerably more grave and considerably more thoughtful, and his eyes possessed that quality of absolute clarity that suggested that the fundamental outlines of a previously obscure matter had suddenly, and with considerable violence, become apparent. It was at this moment that Inspector Blackwood appeared in the doorway, his countenance bearing the particular expression of mingled frustration and necessity that characterizes the police officer who has been obliged to deliver unwelcome intelligence to a superior intellect. He informed Whimsy that the butler, Harrison, had been apprehended by the village constable some 3 miles distant upon the post road, apparently engaged in a somewhat hurried departure from the neighborhood with a small traveling case and a sum of money that the household staff could not immediately account for. The inspector appeared to regard this development as substantially corroborative of his original thesis, suggesting that the butler's flight indicated consciousness of guilt regarding some criminal enterprise, though he seemed prepared to entertain the possibility that the crime in question might not be suicide, but rather murder committed by a domestic servant of the established type. Whimsy received this intelligence with a degree of philosophical calm that appeared to frustrate the inspector considerably, remarking only that the evidence suggested nothing of the sort, though he acknowledged that Mr. Harrison's untimely departure was doubtless worthy of investigation. He then requested that Harrison be brought to Ashford Manor rather than to the police station, expressing the view that certain matters were best clarified within the environment in which they had occurred, a suggestion that Inspector Blackwood accepted with visible reluctance, and the sort of grudging acknowledgement that indicated he had become sufficiently accustomed to Whimsy's methods to recognize that resistance would prove ultimately futile. The butler, when he arrived some 3/4 of an hour later in the custody of 2 constables, presented a figure of considerable agitation, his usual demeanor of impeccable propriety having been displaced by something approaching panic. He was a man of perhaps 55 years, possessed of that quality of distinguished appearance that the British upper classes value in their servants, with silver hair and features that suggested a certain refinement of upbringing. Upon being assured that no immediate accusation was being levelled against him, Harrison gradually recovered a measure of composure and proceeded to offer an explanation for his departure that was, from a certain perspective, entirely reasonable. He had received word, he explained, that a distant relative had suffered a serious accident and lay in hospital some distance away, and he had felt compelled to depart immediately in order to attend to family matters. When pressed for details regarding the precise identity of this relative and the location of the hospital in question, Harrison's composure wavered considerably, and he admitted with evident shame that the true motivation for his departure had been something considerably more sordid. He had been engaged, he confessed, in a small financial arrangement with a person of questionable reputation from whom he required money with considerable urgency, and he had, in a moment of what he described as temporary insanity, abstracted a sum from the household accounts with the intention of replacing it upon receipt of funds from a personal source. The sum in question, he was at pains to emphasize, was modest, scarcely more than £30, and he harbored not the slightest doubt regarding his ability to replenish the household accounts before such absence would have been detected. Whimsy listened to this narrative with an expression of sympathetic attention, occasionally interjecting with questions that, while appearing to be merely confirmatory in nature, served actually to establish with precision the chronology of Harrison's movements during the previous 24 hours. It emerged that the butler had been in his pantry, engaged in the polishing of silver, until approximately 9 o'clock on the previous evening, at which time he had retired to his room with the professed intention of addressing correspondence of a personal nature. He had not been observed by any other member of the household staff after that hour, though he asserted with considerable confidence that he had been awake until midnight, engaged in reading, and had subsequently retired to sleep. When Whimsy inquired, with what appeared to be casual interest, whether Harrison had observed Mr. Carstairs to leave the house on the previous evening, the butler's response was immediate and emphatic in the negative. The master, Harrison stated, had taken his dinner at his usual hour, had subsequently withdrawn to his study for the customary postprandial occupation of reading the evening newspaper and consuming a modest quantity of brandy, and had, to Harrison's knowledge and observation, not quitted the house during the evening hours. It was at this precise moment that Whimsy intervened with a question that possessed the quality of what one might describe as casual but penetrating curiosity. He inquired whether the household possessed a rear exit from the study, or whether the only access to that room was through the main corridor. Harrison, somewhat mystified by the relevance of this inquiry, explained that the study indeed possessed a secondary door, which gave access to the morning room and thence to the conservatory, from which one might reach the rear garden through a series of passages and auxiliary rooms. This fact, Harrison noted with obvious embarrassment, was known to very few members of the household, as the door was rarely employed and had been permitted to fall into a state of considerable disrepair. Whimsy received this intelligence with what appeared to be profound satisfaction, and he proceeded then to ask Harrison whether he had, at any point during the previous evening, been required to address any repairs to the household's plumbing arrangements, or whether he had observed any indication that such repairs might be in progress. Harrison's response was negative, though he noted that the pipes in the upper corridor had been producing sounds of unusual intensity for some weeks. A fact that he had mentioned to the master on several occasions without effect. It was at this juncture that Margaret, the chambermaid, who had remained hovering near the doorway with an expression of increasing distress, suddenly emitted a small sound, scarcely more than a gasp, and appeared upon the verge of collapse. Mrs. Pemberton, with the practiced efficiency of one long accustomed to managing such domestic crises, guided the girl to a chair, whilst Whimsy regarded the proceedings with an expression of interest that suggested that this development, far from surprising him, had been anticipated with considerable precision. He requested, in a tone of gentle but absolute authority, that Margaret explain the precise nature of the distress that had occasioned her near collapse, and whether it related, by any possibility, to events that had occurred during the hours of darkness on the previous evening. Margaret's response, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, and yet it possessed the quality of an utterance that, once delivered, irrevocably altered the landscape of the investigation. Margaret's confession, when it finally emerged from her trembling lips, concerned itself not with any direct knowledge of the events surrounding Mr. Carstairs' death, but rather with a secret that she had been at considerable pains to conceal, and that now, under the weight of Whimsy's quiet and inexorable scrutiny, could no longer be maintained in its previous state of concealment. She had, she admitted in a voice scarcely audible above the ticking of the drawing-room clock, been engaged in a clandestine relationship with the master of the house for a period of approximately 14 months. This relationship, she was at pains to emphasize, had not been initiated through any moral failings upon her own part, but rather through a sustained campaign of persuasion and manipulation conduct. Ted by Mr. Carstairs, who had exploited her vulnerable position as a young woman of modest circumstances, dependent upon her employment for survival. The relationship had taken place primarily during the daylight hours, when the other servants were engaged in their duties, and had been conducted with a degree of secrecy that had necessitated certain elaborate arrangements and precautions. Upon being pressed for specifics regarding the nature of these precautions, Margaret confessed that she had been required to enter the study through the rear passage and the conservatory, thereby avoiding the necessity of traversing the main corridors where she might encounter other members of the household staff. Furthermore, upon several occasions, Mr. Carstairs had instructed her to remain within the study for extended periods whilst he conducted his business in other rooms, and she had occupied this time by engaging in needlework or reading, waiting until such time as the master deemed it prudent for her to depart. This revelation, while undoubtedly of considerable moral significance and bearing substantially upon one's assessment of Mr. Carstairs' character, appeared to possess for Whimsy a significance that extended considerably beyond the mere matter of personal misconduct. He inquired, with a delicacy that seemed scarcely appropriate to the circumstances, but which nonetheless conveyed a complete absence of judgment, whether Margaret had been present in the study during any portion of the previous evening. The girl's response was an emphatic negative, accompanied by a rush of explanatory detail that tumbled from her lips with the force of dammed water suddenly released. She had not been summoned to the study on the previous evening, she insisted, and indeed she had not seen the master at all after he had taken his dinner. She had been engaged in her duties in the upper corridor until approximately 9 o'clock, at which time she had retired to her room, and she had subsequently been awakened during the night by the sound of the pipes, which had produced a particularly violent cacophony at some hour between midnight and 1 o'clock. She had risen from her bed, she explained, in order to ascertain whether the noise indicated some genuine malfunction that might require immediate attention, and in doing so she had observed, quite by accident, she hastened to assure all parties, that the light in the study was illuminated, and that there appeared to be some movement within that room. Whimsy's response to this intelligence was to rise abruptly from his chair and request that Margaret conduct him immediately to her bedroom, where he wished to examine the precise angle from which she had observed the study window and to ascertain what details she might have perceived regarding the nature of the activity occurring within. The household party proceeded accordingly up the narrow servants' staircase to the 3rd floor, where the domestic staff maintained their modest quarters in rooms of considerable cramped proportions that contrasted sharply with the spacious and well-appointed chambers occupied by the family. Margaret's room was small but meticulously maintained, her few possessions arranged with a care that suggested either substantial personal discipline or the psychological necessity of imposing order upon one's limited sphere of control. Upon reaching the window, Whimsy positioned himself at precisely the angle from which Margaret had observed the study, and he requested that the girl describe in meticulous detail everything she had observed during that interval in the small hours of the morning. Margaret's account, haltingly delivered and punctuated by pauses, during which she appeared to be retrieving details from memory with considerable difficulty. "Thank you," concerned itself with the observation of what appeared to be 2 figures engaged in some form of violent struggle or altercation. One figure, she was confident, had been that of the master, and the other appeared to have been a person of somewhat stockier build, though the darkness and the considerable distance had rendered the identity of the second party entirely uncertain. Inspector Blackwood, who had been listening to these proceedings with an expression of mounting bewilderment, suddenly interjected with the observation that this testimony appeared to constitute direct evidence of a struggle occurring within the study at a time when the supposed victim was subsequently discovered hanging from an archway in the gardens. If Margaret's account was accurate, he suggested, then the murder must have occurred within the study itself, and the subsequent transportation of the body to the archway must have been undertaken by the second party whom Margaret had observed. When pressed to identify this mysterious assailant, Margaret could only reiterate that she had been unable to distinguish the individual's features with any degree of clarity, though there had been something about the figure's bearing and manner of movement that had seemed somehow familiar to her, though she could not precisely articulate the nature of this familiarity. It was at this juncture that Whimsy, who had been gazing out from Margaret's window toward the study with an expression of profound and almost melancholy contemplation, turned back to face the assembled company with a smile of extraordinary and somewhat disturbing serenity. He remarked, in a tone that suggested that he was merely confirming details already apparent to the most cursory observer, that the situation had become considerably more complex than the local constabulary had initially supposed, and that it would be necessary to conduct UCT a considerably more thorough examination of certain details that had hitherto been regarded as peripheral to the matter at hand. Whimsy's examination of the study proceeded with a methodicality that appeared to the casual observer to border upon the obsessive, though those who had witnessed his investigative methods on previous occasions recognized in this apparent fixation the manifestation of a mind engaged in the process of reconstructing events with a precision that transcended the merely forensic and approached something approaching the visionary. He began his inquiry by requesting that the household staff retire, with the exception of Mrs. Pemberton, who was instructed to remain in order to respond to queries regarding the precise arrangement of the room's furnishings and the chronology of any alterations that might have been undertaken within the past several months. Inspector Blackwood and his constables were similarly requested to remain at a distance, though not before Whimsy had requested that a constable be positioned outside the study door with instructions to permit no one to enter or depart without his express authorization. Once these arrangements had been concluded to his satisfaction, Whimsy turned his attention to the room itself with the air of a scholar approaching a particularly challenging textual puzzle. The study was a room of considerable masculine character, dominated by a substantial mahogany desk of Victorian manufacture, behind which stood a leather chair of considerable age and, one suspected, considerable expense. The walls were lined with bookcases containing what appeared to be a respectable but undistinguished collection of volumes, interspersed with various objets d'art that suggested a man of moderate aesthetic sensibility but considerable financial resources. Upon the mantelpiece stood a number of framed photographs, and it was toward these that Whimsy's attention was initially directed. He examined each photograph with a care that seemed to Mrs. Pemberton entirely disproportionate to their apparent significance, requesting information regarding the identity of each person depicted and the approximate date upon which each image had been captured. Most of the photographs appeared to concern themselves with Mr. Carstairs in various stages of his life, often depicted in the company of other gentlemen of apparently similar social station. Though there was one photograph, positioned somewhat apart from the others and occupying a place of what appeared to be deliberate prominence upon the mantelpiece, that depicted a young woman of considerable beauty, dressed in the fashion of approximately 25 years previous. When Whimsy inquired regarding the identity of this young woman, Mrs. Pemberton's response was accompanied by a visible softening of her features and a quality of wistfulness that suggested that the photograph held significance extending considerably beyond its merely artistic merit. The young woman depicted, Mrs. Pemberton explained, had been the wife of Mr. Carstairs, a marriage that had been contracted some 28 years previously and which had been terminated by the death of the young woman in childbirth, a tragedy that had occurred scarcely 3 months following the solemnization of the marriage ceremony. Mr. Carstairs had, according to Mrs. Pemberton's account, never subsequently married, having devoted himself instead to the management of his considerable estates and the cultivation of what could best be described as a misanthropic disposition. He had, Mrs. Pemberton noted with evident disapproval, become increasingly embittered as the years advanced, and had developed certain habits and inclinations that she refrained from articulating with precision, though her tongue and expression rendered her meaning sufficiently clear to anyone possessed of minimal perceptiveness. Whimsy received this historical narrative with an expression of sympathetic interest, and he proceeded then to examine the remaining contents of the study with a systematic thoroughness that characterized all aspects of his investigative methodology. It was upon the desk that Whimsy's attention became most intently focused, and it was here that he made a discovery that appeared to possess considerable significance, though its exact relevance remained, for the moment, obscure. Beneath the blotter that covered the writing surface of the desk, he discovered a collection of letters written in an evidently female hand and bearing dates that ranged across a period of approximately 3 months. These letters, though not explicit in their nature, appeared to contain communications of an emotional and romantic character, addressed to my dearest Edmund, and signed with a name that proved, upon investigation, to correspond with that of a certain Mrs. Alice Hendricks, the widow of a gentleman of some standing in the local community and resident in a property situated approximately 2 miles distant from Ashford Manor. When Whimsy inquired whether Mrs. Pemberton was acquainted with Mrs. Hendricks, the housekeeper's response was affirmative, accompanied by a tightening of her lips that suggested considerable moral disapprobation. Mrs. Hendricks was, according to Mrs. Pemberton's account, a woman of dubious character who maintained what could most charitably be described as an excessive familiarity with certain gentlemen of the neighborhood, and whose visits to Ashford Manor had occasioned considerable speculation among the domestic staff regarding the precise nature of the business that occupied the attention of Mr. Carstairs during these visits. Whimsy's response to this intelligence was to request that Mrs. Hendricks be summoned to Ashford Manor at her earliest convenience, a request that was executed forthwith through the agency of a constable dispatched to convey the message. Whilst awaiting her arrival, Whimsy conducted a further examination of the study, paying particular attention to the rear door through which Margaret had entered on previous occasions, and which he discovered, upon investigation, to bear the marks of recent disturbance upon its lock mechanism, suggesting that it had been forced or otherwise subjected to considerable mechanical stress within the recent past. He then requested that Mrs. Pemberton conduct him to the study's secondary chamber, which he had ascertained existed through a door concealed behind one of the bookcases, a space that appeared to have served as a private retiring room for Mr. Carstairs, and which contained a small writing desk, a comfortable chair, and a collection of personal effects that seemed to relate to aspects of the master's character not readily apparent from casual observation. It was here, concealed within a locked drawer beneath a layer of innocuous correspondence, that Whimsy discovered a journal bound in black leather and filled with entries in Mr. Carstairs' own hand. Entries that appeared to chronicle a psychological deterioration of considerable severity. The journal entries, spanning a period of approximately 2 years, presented a portrait of a man engaged in an increasingly desperate struggle against sentiments and obsessions that he appeared to regard as fundamentally aberrant and requiring concealment from the scrutiny of polite society. The earlier entries concerned themselves primarily with reflections upon Mr. Carstairs' late wife, whom he had apparently idealized to a degree that bordered upon the pathological, and with expressions of profound bitterness regarding the perceived injustice of her premature death. As the entries progressed chronologically, however, a new theme began to emerge with increasing insistence, an obsession with the notion that Margaret, the young chambermaid, bore a striking physical resemblance to the deceased wife at a comparable age. The entries grew progressively more disturbing in their psychological implications, chronicling what appeared to be Mr. Carstairs' interpretation of this perceived resemblance as constituting some form of providential compensation for his earlier loss, and his subsequent conviction that he possessed both the right and the obligation to recreate, through means that the entries rendered sufficiently clear, certain aspects of his relationship with his deceased spouse through the instrumentality of the living young woman. The later entries took on a quality of increasingly fractured reasoning, with Mr. Carstairs articulating elaborate justifications for his actions and simultaneously expressing profound guilt and self-recrimination regarding the same conduct. There were references to conversations with an unnamed individual whom Mr. Carstairs appeared to regard as a confidant, though the entries rendered no explicit identification of this person's identity. There were also repeated allusions to certain documents relating to Mr. Carstairs' financial affairs and to a specific item of considerable personal significance, the precise nature of which remained somewhat obscure, though the emotional intensity surrounding these references suggested their importance was considerable. Most significantly, the final entries, dating from the preceding week, contained language suggestive of a man approaching some form of psychological or emotional terminus, with repeated references to the notion that matters could not continue in their present state, and that resolution must be achieved, whatever the cost to oneself or to others. The final entry, dated the evening prior to the discovery of Mr. Carstairs' body, consisted of a single sentence written in a hand that appeared to quiver with emotional intensity. "Tonight, the pretense ends, and truth shall be revealed, though the revelation destroys all that I have constructed." It was at the precise moment that Whimsy was concluding his examination of these entries that word arrived, that Mrs. Alice Hendricks had been conveyed to Ashford Manor and was awaiting reception in the drawing-room. Whimsy's expression underwent a subtle alteration upon receiving this intelligence, and he carefully returned the journal to its place of concealment, instructing Mrs. Pemberton that the contents of the secondary chamber were to remain undisturbed and that no member of the household staff was to be permitted access to the space pending his further instructions. Upon descending to the drawing-room, Whimsy found Mrs. Hendricks to be a woman of approximately 50 years of age, possessed of those physical characteristics that might be described as handsome rather than beautiful, though her bearing and demeanor suggested a woman of considerable self-possession and sang-froid. She was dressed in garments of considerable expense and fashionable design, and she greeted Whimsy's inquiry regarding her acquaintance with the deceased with a candor that suggested either innocence of any involvement in his death or a degree of composure that bordered upon the sociopathic. Mrs. Hendricks' account of her relationship with Mr. Carstairs was rendered with a frankness that appeared to surprise Inspector Blackwood considerably, though Whimsy received her narrative with an expression suggesting that nothing concerning human motivation could occasion in him any particular astonishment. She had, she explained, become acquainted with Mr. Carstairs approximately 6 months previously through the auspices of a mutual acquaintance at a social gathering, and she had subsequently engaged in what could most accurately be described as a romantic association with the gentleman, an association that had been conducted with considerable discretion, though not, she was at pains to emphasize, with any sense of shame or impropriety upon her part. She had believed, she stated with evident sincerity, that Mr. Carstairs harbored sentiments of a more permanent nature toward her, and that their association might ultimately lead to a formalization of their relationship through matrimonial arrangement. However, she had become aware, within the past fortnight, that Mr. Carstairs' emotional and psychological state had undergone a considerable deterioration, and that his attentions had become characterized by an increasing degree of what she could only describe as obsessive and irrational behavior. Upon being pressed for specifics regarding the nature of this deterioration, Mrs. Hendricks confessed that Mr. Carstairs had begun to make statements suggestive of a conviction that she bore a marked resemblance to an individual whom he had apparently loved with considerable intensity in his youth, and that he had begun to attribute to her various characteristics and personality traits that she did not in fact possess. Furthermore, he had begun to express sentiments suggestive of a belief that she was engaged in some form of conspiracy against him, that her emotional responses to him were calculated rather than genuine, and that she was, in essence, a fraudulent representation of the individual whom she supposedly resembled. Most disturbingly, on the occasion of his final visit to her residence on the day prior to his death, he had become violent, making accusations of an exceedingly specific nature and producing what appeared to be documentary evidence that he claimed demonstrated her infidelity and her collusion with an unnamed third party to deceive and defraud him. When Whimsy inquired regarding the precise nature of this documentary evidence, Mrs. Hendricks confessed that she could not ascertain what specific materials Mr. Carstairs had been referencing, though his manner and the vehemence of his accusations suggested that he believed himself to have discovered something of considerable significance regarding her past. It was at this juncture that Whimsy posed a question that appeared to possess, for him, significance extending considerably beyond the merely informational, inquiring whether Mrs. Hendricks possessed any knowledge regarding the identity of an individual named Reginald Carstairs, and whether she was acquainted with the particulars of that person's relationship to the deceased Mr. Edmund Carstairs. The effect of this inquiry upon Mrs. Hendricks was dramatic and immediate, her composure fragmenting with visible violence as she rose abruptly from her chair, her face draining of color to a degree suggestive of profound shock. She demanded to know, in a voice that quivered with what appeared to be a combination of fear and rage, how Whimsy had come into possession of that name, and whether Mr. Edmund Carstairs had been engaged in some form of investigation concerning her past. When Whimsy responded with his characteristic equanimity that he had merely been conducting a routine examination of the deceased's personal papers and had encountered references to a person of that description, Mrs. Hendricks' response was to sink back into her chair with the aspect of an individual upon whom some terrible weight had suddenly been imposed. She then proceeded, with evident reluctance and with pauses that suggested she was struggling against considerable emotional resistance, to provide an account of certain events that had transpired approximately 25 years previously, and which she had, until the present moment, believed to be safely consigned to the obscurity of the distant past. Mrs. Hendricks had, she explained, been married in her youth to a gentleman named Henry Hendricks, a marriage that had been entered into with considerable enthusiasm, but which had proved to be fundamentally incompatible in nature. Her husband had been a man of considerable charm but equally considerable moral deficiency, and the marriage had been characterized by his repeated infidelities and his systematic financial irresponsibility. During the course of this unhappy union, she had become acquainted with a young man named Reginald Carstairs, the younger brother of Mr. Edmund Carstairs, and a relationship of a romantic nature had developed between them, a relationship that had remained, at all times, entirely chaste in its physical manifestations, but which had nonetheless been profound in its emotional significance. This relationship had been conducted in conditions of considerable secrecy, as both parties had been acutely conscious of the impropriety that would attach to any public acknowledgement of their emotional attachment. However, the situation had been terminated with considerable abruptness when Reginald Carstairs had been killed in a hunting accident, an accident that various accounts in the local press of the time had suggested might not have been entirely accidental in nature, though no formal investigation had ever been undertaken to clarify the precise circumstances of his death. The implication contained within this narrative, though never explicitly articulated, hung in the air with considerable force, and Whimsy's response was to request that Mrs. Hendricks provide additional details regarding the circumstances of Reginald Carstairs' death and regarding any suspicions that might have attached to particular individuals regarding the true nature of the incident. Mrs. Hendricks confessed that she had always harbored the conviction that Edmund Carstairs, Reginald's elder brother, had been responsible for the death, motivated by what she could only characterize as a pathological jealousy and a determination to prevent his younger brother from engaging in a relationship that Edmund regarded as beneath the family's social standing. However, she had never possessed any concrete evidence to support this conviction, and the passage of time had rendered such accusations increasingly implausible and potentially defamatory. Furthermore, upon Edmund's inheritance of the family estates following the death of their father some years subsequently, he had made subtle but unmistakable overtures toward her, overtures that she had initially rejected but which he had pursued with an increasing degree of intensity and what she could now recognize as an obsessive fixation upon his younger brother's emotional attachment to her. Inspector Blackwood, who had been listening to these proceedings with an expression of mounting confusion, interjected to inquire whether Mrs. Hendricks was suggesting that Mr. Edmund Carstairs had murdered his brother and had subsequently pursued Mrs. Hendricks over a period of decades in order to reconstruct the relationship that had existed between his brother and the lady in question. When Mrs. Hendricks confirmed that such was indeed her interpretation of events, the inspector appeared to regard this suggestion as substantially confirmatory of a theory that had been forming in his mind regarding the present case, and he began to articulate a hypothesis suggesting that Mr. Carstairs had, upon discovering that Mrs. Hendricks was not in fact the idealized figure that his obsessive imaginings had constructed, determined to rid himself of his attachment through means most violent. However, Whimsy's response to this emerging theory was to shake his head with a degree of gentle but absolute contradiction, remarking that the inspector's reasoning, while possessing a certain superficial plausibility, was fundamentally misconceived regarding both the psychological motivation for the crime and the identity of the individual principally responsible for its execution. He proceeded then to request that all assembled parties return to the drawing room, where he proposed to undertake a reconstruction of events that would, he suggested with evident confidence, clarify those aspects of the matter that remained obscure. Inspector Blackwood appeared inclined to resist this theatrical approach to investigation, though he ultimately acquiesced, recognizing that Whimsy's methods, while unconventional to the point of eccentricity, had historically produced results that entirely vindicated their departure from conventional police procedure. As the household staff, Mrs. Hendricks, the inspector, and the constables assembled in the drawing-room, Whimsy positioned himself before the fireplace with the air of a conductor preparing to orchestrate a symphony of revelations, his expression characterized by a quality of melancholy certainty that suggested he was approaching the articulation of truths that, while intellectually satisfying, possessed a dimension of human tragedy that occasioned in him a degree of genuine sorrow. Whimsy began his exposition with the observation that, while superficially tangential to the matter at hand, possessed for him a significance that would become increasingly apparent as his narrative unfolded. He remarked upon the peculiar characteristics of the Willow Footpath and the archway that spanned it, noting that the structure had been constructed at a period when Mr. Edmund Carstairs' father had still been in possession of the estates, and that it had been designed specifically as a memorial to a deceased member of the family, commemorating through its inscription and architectural particularity an individual whose death had occasioned considerable sorrow within the household. Upon being pressed to identify this deceased individual, Whimsy produced from his waistcoat pocket a small notebook in which he had inscribed certain observations made during his examination of the archway itself, observations which revealed that the inscription, though weathered by the passage of time and obscured by the growth of ivy, bore the name of Reginald Carstairs and commemorated his death in what the inscription designated as a tragic hunting accident in the year 1901. The archway, Whimsy suggested, represented Edmund Carstairs' public acknowledgement of his brother's death, whilst simultaneously serving as a permanent reminder of the emotional and psychological catastrophe that the death had occasioned in Edmund's own psychological development. Whimsy proceeded then to articulate a theory regarding the circumstances of Edmund Carstairs' death that differed fundamentally from the interpretation that the police had initially advanced. The body suspended from the archway, he suggested, was not the result of suicide, nor was it the consequence of a murder committed by any of the individuals upon whom suspicion had initially fallen. Rather, it represented a carefully orchestrated and psychologically complex act of self-destruction undertaken by a man whose mental faculties had become progressively more compromised by obsessive rumination, and whose psychological integration had been fundamentally undermined by the collision between his fantasies and the brutal realities of human existence. The timing of the death, immediately following his violent confrontation with Mrs. Hendricks, was not coincidental but rather represented the final rupture in Edmund's already fragile psychological equilibrium. Upon discovering that the woman upon whom he had focused his obsessive attentions possessed a history and an emotional allegiance that transcended his own fantasies regarding her nature, Edmund had experienced what might be described as a psychic disintegration of considerable severity. The mechanism by which Edmund had achieved his death, Whimsy continued, revealed itself upon careful examination to possess a degree of elaborate planning and psychological sophistication that suggested it had not been the impulsive act of a man in the grip of suicidal despair, but rather the calculated execution of a predetermined design. The fragment of grey-green fabric discovered upon the archway, which Whimsy proceeded to produce from his pocket with theatrical precision, had originated not from Edmund Carstairs' own clothing, but rather from the upholstery of the morning-room chair upon which he had customarily seated himself whilst conducting his various affairs. This fabric had become attached to his person through a mechanism of considerable ingenuity. Edmund had constructed an elaborate apparatus utilizing the morning-room chair as a point of departure for what he had intended to be perceived as a suicide, but which was, in actuality, a carefully staged performance designed to communicate, through the symbolism of the location and the method, a final message to those who remained behind. The reconstruction of Edmund's actions during the hours of darkness on the previous evening proceeded as follows, according to Whimsy's articulation. After his violent confrontation with Mrs. Hendricks, Edmund had returned to Ashford Manor in a state of psychological extremity. He had then orchestrated an elaborate deception designed to provide himself with access to the Willow Footpath during the hours when observation from the household would be minimal. He had deliberately created disturbances in the household's plumbing arrangements, causing those violent sounds that Margaret had observed and that had occasioned her emergence from her bedroom at the precise hour that Edmund had anticipated. This disturbance served two purposes. It provided Margaret with a pretext for being awake and observing activity within the study, and it simultaneously created a temporal marker that would establish the approximate hour of death with considerable precision. Edmund had then donned clothing that was deliberately selected to possess certain ambiguous characteristics, clothing that would appear, when viewed from a distance, and in conditions of inadequate illumination, to be either that of Edmund himself or that of some unidentified second party. The elaborate staging of the death itself revealed, upon examination, a psychological sophistication born of Edmund's desperate desire to communicate certain truths whilst simultaneously obscuring others. The knot securing the rope to the archway was executed with a precision suggesting intimate familiarity with nautical methodology, familiarity that Edmund possessed from his service in the Royal Navy during his youth. The positioning of the body upon the archway served a dual purpose. It created a visual tableau that deliberately evoked the memorial aspect of the saint, rupture, while simultaneously enacting a final statement regarding the psychological continuity between Edmund's relationship with his deceased brother and his relationship with Mrs. Hendricks. The elaborate apparatus that Edmund had constructed utilized the morning-room chair as a launching point, a mechanism whereby he had positioned the chair beneath a particular section of the archway, mounted it, adjusted the rope about his neck with careful precision, and then, through what Whimsy suggested with quiet certainty was an act of deliberate volition rather than suicidal impulse, stepped backward into the void. The crucial detail that established the true nature of Edmund's death, according to Whimsy's exposition, concerned the precise relationship between the positioning of the body and the architectural configuration of the archway itself. Edmund had chosen the location with meticulous care, selecting a point upon the arch that was directly above the memorial inscription bearing his brother's name. Furthermore, the time of death, established through careful consideration of Margaret's observation and the precise degree of rigor mortis evident in the body, coincided almost exactly with the hour at which Edmund's violent confrontation with Mrs. Hendricks had reached its psychological terminus. The suicide was not, therefore, an impulsive act, but rather a carefully orchestrated performance designed to achieve a final objective that extended considerably beyond the mere termination of his own existence. It was at this juncture in Whimsy's exposition that Inspector Blackwood, whose expression had undergone a progressive alteration from confusion to comprehension, and thence to a species of bewildered acceptance, ventured to inquire what objective Edmund Carstairs could possibly have hoped to achieve through such an elaborate staging of his own death. Whimsy's response was to direct the assembled company's attention toward a particular document that he produced from his jacket, with the air of one who had been reserving this revelation for the precise moment when its full significance could be most thoroughly appreciated. The document in question proved to be a will, executed in Edmund's own hand and bearing the date of the previous afternoon, a will that represented a complete reversal of the dispositions contained in Edmund's previous testamentary arrangements. In this final document, Edmund had designated as the primary beneficiary of his considerable estate a certain Margaret Ellen Foster, the chambermaid who had engaged in the illicit relationship with him, with the specific stipulation that the bequest be made contingent upon her undertaking a course of education and refinement that would, as Edmund had articulated with evident care, elevate her condition to a station commensurate with her true capacities and deserving of respect in society. Furthermore, the will contained a substantial bequest to Mrs. Alice Hendricks, designated specifically for the purpose of reparation for wrongs committed by my family in the past and acknowledgement of injustices that I have myself perpetuated. The psychological implications of these testamentary provisions were rendered explicit through the agency of a letter written in Edmund's own hand and sealed with instructions that it be opened only upon the discovery of his body. Wimsey proceeded to read this document aloud, his voice maintaining a carefully modulated tone that conveyed the emotional intensity of the original whilst preserving a degree of narrative detachment appropriate to the judicial presentation of evidence. In the letter, Edmund articulated with considerable psychological clarity his recognition that his emotional attachment to Margaret had been fundamentally pathological in nature, rooted not in any genuine affection for the young woman herself, but rather in his desperate attempt to reconstruct, through the instrumentality of her physical resemblance to his deceased wife, a past that could never be recovered. He acknowledged, with a degree of self-awareness that suggested the letter had been composed during a period of psychological lucidity, that his pursuit of Margaret constituted an exploitation and abuse of her vulnerable position, and that his romantic attachment to Mrs. Hendricks had been similarly distorted by his obsessive identification of her with his deceased brother's betrothed. Most significantly, the letter contained an explicit confession regarding the circumstances of his brother Reginald's death. Edmund acknowledged that the hunting accident had not, in fact, been accidental at all, but rather had been deliberately engineered by Edmund himself through a mechanism of considerable mechanical ingenuity designed to appear, upon superficial examination, to be the consequence of an unfortunate accident. The motivation for this crime, Edmund explained, had been his conviction that Reginald's relationship with Alice Hendricks represented a betrayal of family interests and a debasement of the family's social standing through Reginald's intention to marry a woman whose husband, though deceased, had bequeathed to her a reputation for impropriety and moral irregularity. Edmund had, in the years subsequent to this crime, maintained a facade of respectability whilst being progressively consumed by guilt and remorse, a guilt that had manifested itself in the form of an obsessive fixation upon both Mrs. Hendricks and, subsequently, upon Margaret, whom he perceived as bearing a physical resemblance to his wife that he had interpreted as a form of psychological compensation for his various moral failures. The letter concluded with Edmund's explicit statement that his suicide was undertaken not merely as an escape from the consequences of his actions, but as a deliberate attempt to provide, through the medium of his death and the terms of his testament, a form of reparation and restitution that his living conduct could never adequately accomplish. He had positioned his body upon the willow archway, he explained, as a final acknowledgement of the continuity between his crime against his brother and his subsequent emotional exploitation of those individuals who had been connected, however tangentially, to the consequences of that original transgression. The archway, which his father had erected as a memorial to Reginald, would thereby become simultaneously a memorial to Edmund's final act of psychological expiation and a physical manifestation of the consequences of unchecked passion and unresolved guilt. The effect of Wimsey's reading of this document upon the assembled company was profound and multifaceted. Mrs. Hendricks wept with what appeared to be a complex admixture of grief, vindication, and a species of bitter recognition regarding the psychological forces that had shaped the lives of the Carstairs family across more than a quarter-century. Margaret, upon comprehending that Edmund's final act had been undertaken, at least in part, with the intention of providing her with financial security and social elevation, manifested a response that oscillated between gratitude for the material provisions and profound disturbance at the realization that she had been the object of an emotional attachment so fundamentally distorted by psychological pathology. Harrison, the butler, who had been present throughout Whimsy's exposition, appeared to experience a form of vindication regarding his own precipitous departure, which was now revealed to have been motivated not by criminal consciousness, but rather by his long-standing knowledge of Edmund's psychological deterioration and his conviction that some catastrophic event was imminent. Inspector Blackwood, confronted with evidence of a crime committed more than a quarter-century previously, and the testimony, however indirect, of a confession penned by the perpetrator immediately prior to his self-inflicted death, found himself in the position of possessing knowledge of a serious criminal transgression, for which prosecution was now rendered impossible by the death of the perpetrator. Whimsy offered the observation, with characteristic philosophical detachment, that the machinery of justice often operated in mysterious ways, and that the law, while possessed of considerable power to punish malefactors, was frequently forced to acknowledge the limitations of human institutions when confronted with the complexities of human psychology and the inexorable passage of time. The formal proceedings attendant upon the conclusion of the investigation proceeded with a deliberateness that reflected the complexity and sensitivity of the circumstances that had come to light through Whimsy's exposition. Inspector Blackwood, after consultation with the Crown Solicitor and various other officials whose involvement was deemed necessary, determined that the matter would be classified as a suicide, with the additional notation that certain historical offenses had been acknowledged by the deceased, but that the passage of time and the death of the perpetrator rendered prosecution impossible and, indeed, inappropriate. The testamentary provisions made by Edmund Carstairs were subjected to the scrutiny of the legal profession, where they were ultimately upheld, though not without considerable debate, regarding the validity of a will executed under conditions suggestive of severe psychological disturbance. The court ultimately concluded that while Edmund's mental state at the time of executing the will was questionable, the provisions themselves were not so irrational as to suggest that he had been entirely bereft of testamentary capacity, and the will was accordingly admitted to probate with relatively minimal adjustment. The material consequences of Edmund's final disposition of his estate proved to be of considerable significance for those individuals who had occupied prominent positions in the drama that had unfolded at Ashford Manor. Margaret, upon attaining her inheritance and receiving the sum of money that Edmund had designated for her education and social elevation, found herself in the position of possessing both the financial resources and the opportunity to escape from the circumstances of domestic service that had previously constrained her existence. With the assistance of Mrs. Pemberton, who undertook the role of mentor and sponsor with considerable dedication, Margaret was enrolled in a course of study at an academy of considerable reputation, where she devoted herself to acquiring those accomplishments and refinements that Edmund had stipulated in his will. Within the space of 2 years, she had transformed herself from a young woman of modest circumstances into a person of considerable accomplishment, securing a position as a companion to an elderly woman of quality who resided in London and who became, in the fullness of time, sufficiently attached to Margaret to leave to her a modest but respectable inheritance upon her death. Mrs. Hendricks, upon receiving the bequest that Edmund had designated for her in his testament, discovered within the accompanying documentation a letter of considerable length in which Edmund had articulated, with a degree of psychological penetration that suggested genuine remorse, his recognition of the wrongs that he and his family had perpetrated upon her across the decades. He bequest proved to be of such magnitude as to permit her to undertake a degree of philanthropic work that she had long desired to pursue, and she devoted the remainder of her years to the establishment of a charitable institution designed to provide shelter and assistance to women of modest circumstances who found themselves in situations of vulnerability or distress. Her involvement in this enterprise, conducted with considerable dedication and personal sacrifice, resulted in a degree of social rehabilitation that would have been impossible through the ordinary channels of conventional society. and she became, in her later years, a figure of considerable respect within the charitable community. The disposition of Ashford Manor itself proved to be a matter of considerable complexity, as Edmund's will had designated the property to be held in trust for a period of 10 years, after which it was to be sold and the proceeds divided among various charitable institutions that Edmund had selected with apparent care. During the interim period of trusteeship, the manor was let to a succession of tenants, and Mrs. Pemberton, upon being offered the opportunity to retire from active service, instead accepted a position as housekeeper overseeing the property's maintenance, a position that permitted her to remain in residence and to benefit from the security and familiarity of her long association with the establishment. The butler, Harrison, whose flight had been occasioned by financial embarrassment rather than any involvement in Edmund's death, was restored to his position upon the clarification of his circumstances, and he remained in service at Ashford Manor for a period of several additional years before retiring to a small cottage in the village, where he spent his remaining years cultivating a garden and corresponding with his various friends and acquaintances. It was Psalm 3 weeks subsequent to the conclusion of the formal investigation that Wimsey found himself, through the accident of circumstance and certain social obligations, remaining at a country house located in reasonably proximate relationship to Ashford Manor. He accepted an invitation to take afternoon tea with Mrs. Hendricks at her residence, and during the course of this social occasion, their conversation turned, somewhat inevitably, toward a reconsideration of the events that had unfolded during his investigation. Mrs. Hendricks expressed her gratitude for Wimsey's role in exposing the truths that had been concealed for so many years, though she confessed that the knowledge of Edmund's confession regarding Reginald's death had occasioned in her a complex emotional response that she found difficulty in articulating with precision. She acknowledged that, while the exposure of the historical crime had provided a certain satisfaction through the vindication of her long-held suspicions, the knowledge that Edmund had spent more than 2 decades consumed by guilt and remorse had occasioned in her a degree of compassion that she had not anticipated experiencing. Wimsey received these confidences with his customary courtesy, and he proceeded to offer certain observations regarding the nature of guilt and its psychological consequences that suggested a degree of philosophical sophistication, extending considerably beyond the merely forensic aspects of his investigative methodology. He remarked that the human conscience was a faculty of considerable complexity, and that individuals possessed of that faculty in pronounced degree frequently suffered consequences that, while perhaps not commensurate with the magnitude of their crimes, nonetheless partook of a character of punishment that transcended the merely legal or social dimensions of culpability. In Edmund's case, he suggests, the obsessive pursuits that had characterized his later years represented not a flight from guilt, but rather an elaborate and ultimately futile attempt at psychological restitution, a futility that had rendered increasingly evident to Edmund himself the impossibility of achieving genuine expiation through the continuation of living existence. The suicide, therefore, represented not an escape, but rather a final acknowledgement of the irredeemable nature of certain human transgressions. Mrs. Hendricks received these philosophical observations with evident appreciation, and she proceeded to offer Wimsey a second cup of tea, whilst reflecting upon the manner in which time and circumstance had operated to bring about resolutions to situations that had seemed, in their moment, to be entirely beyond the reach of rational resolution. She remarked that she had, in recent weeks, devoted considerable thought to the question of whether Edmund's final act should be regarded as a tragedy or as a form of psychological salvation, and she acknowledged that her conclusions regarding this matter had undergone substantial revision, as she had come to comprehend more fully the nature of the psychological torment that had characterized Edmund's existence across the decades. Wimsey's response was to suggest that such binary categorizations were frequently misleading when applied to the complexities of human experience, and that situations which appeared, upon initial examination, to be either tragic or redemptive, frequently partook of characteristics of both categories in measures that defied precise quantification or hierarchical ordering. The human capacity for self-deception, he observed, was such that individuals frequently succeeded in constructing elaborate psychological narratives that permitted them to regard their most destructive impulses and actions as manifestations of virtue, our misunderstood nobility, a phenomenon that rendered the investigation of human motivation a pursuit of considerable epistemological difficulty. As Whimsy prepared to take his departure from Mrs. Hendrick's residence, having spent a considerable portion of the afternoon in conversation of a philosophically substantive nature, he found himself reflecting upon the investigation that had occupied his attentions during the preceding weeks with a degree of melancholic contemplation that suggested the matter had occasioned in him more profound emotional resonance than his customary manner of detached irony might have suggested. He remarked, upon reaching the threshold of Mrs. Hendrick's drawing-room, that the investigation of Edmund Carstairs' death had possessed a quality of psychological complexity that transcended the merely criminal aspects of the case, and that the resolution of the matter, while satisfactory from the perspective of establishing the facts regarding the death itself, had left unresolved certain questions regarding the nature of human motivation and the psychological forces that rendered otherwise respectable individuals capable of actions that violated the fundamental tenets of morality and social obligation. Mrs. Hendricks accompanied him to the doorway, and as he prepared to depart, she offered him a final observation regarding her conviction that Edmund's ultimate intention in executing the elaborate staging of his own death and in making the provisions contained in his will had been to communicate a message regarding the possibility of redemption and the capacity of human beings to recognize and, to some limited degree, to ameliorate the consequences of their own moral failings. Whimsy's response to this observation was to pause momentarily upon the threshold and to regard Mrs. Hendricks with an expression that combined appreciation for her psyche, a logical acuity with a certain weariness that suggested he had encountered, throughout the course of his investigative career, sufficient evidence of human capacity for both moral degradation and moral aspiration to render him profoundly uncertain regarding the question of whether redemption represented a genuine possibility or merely an elaborate self-deceptive narrative that individuals constructed in order to render tolerable the recognition of their own fundamental corruption. He observed that the passage of time frequently rendered such questions increasingly difficult to resolve with any degree of certainty, and that perhaps the most honest response that one could make to such profound philosophical inquiries was to acknowledge the limits of human knowledge and to accept that certain questions regarding the nature of human motivation and moral accountability ultimately transcended the capacity of rational analysis to resolve with satisfactory finality. Upon returning to London some days subsequently, Whimsy found himself in his study at Piccadilly, engaged in the ritualistic consumption of a particularly fine brandy, whilst perusing certain volumes of classical antiquity that had occupied his scholarly attentions during the periods of his life when the demands of criminal investigation had not pressed upon him with particular urgency. He was interrupted in this occupation by the arrival of a letter bearing the postmark of the village nearest to Ashford Manor, a communication that proved to originate from Mrs. Pemberton, and which contained news regarding the subsequent development of events at the manor and in the village more generally. Mrs. Pemberton reported that Margaret had achieved considerable success in her studies and had secured a position of considerable respectability, and that Mrs. Hendricks had become actively engaged in her philanthropic enterprises, with a degree of dedication that had earned her considerable approbation from those individuals whose opinions possessed social weight and influence. The letter concluded with an observation from Mrs. Pemberton regarding her conviction that Edmund's final act, whatever one's judgment regarding its moral propriety, had ultimately resulted in consequences that could scarcely be characterized as entirely malevolent, and that certain good had emerged from the ashes of his psychological destruction. Whimsy set down the letter and returned his attention to his volume of classical philosophy, pausing for a moment to consider the observation that Mrs. Pemberton had ventured regarding the possibility of good emerging from destruction. He found himself recalling certain passages from the Stoic philosophers regarding the reconciliation of human agency with the operation of fate and circumstance, and he reflected upon the manner in which individual actions, undertaken with particular intentions and motivations, frequently produced consequences that extended far beyond the intentions of the actor and that partook of a character of moral complexity that transcended simple categorization as beneficial or malevolent. The investigation of Edmund Carstairs' death had, he concluded, illustrated this principle with particular clarity and force, suggesting that the human pursuit of justice and understanding, while possessing considerable value as manifestations of rational inquiry, ultimately confronted limitations born of the fundamental inscrutability of human motivation and the impossibility of achieving complete reconciliation between the demands of morality and the complexities of psychological reality. He rose from his chair and moved to the window overlooking Piccadilly, where the traffic of London proceeded with its customary indifference to the philosophical preoccupations of individual consciousness. He reflected that the investigation had concluded satisfactorily from the perspective of establishing the facts regarding Edmund's death, yet he acknowledged that the satisfaction obtained through the resolution of factual ambiguities was frequently accompanied by a diminishment rather than an enhancement of one's comprehension of the fundamental nature of the human condition. He raised his brandy glass in a gesture of ironic salutation toward the passing crowds below, and he permitted himself a slight smile as he acknowledged the fundamental paradox that had characterized his investigative career, that the clarification of external facts frequently obscured rather than illuminated the deeper mysteries of human motivation and moral accountability. The case of Edmund Carstairs, he concluded, represented merely one instance among many of this fundamental epistemological limitation, a limitation that rendered the pursuit of justice perpetually incomplete, and that suggested that complete understanding of human conduct would forever remain beyond the capacity of rational analysis to achieve.